Shalom. Shalom, thank you so much for being here on our Codigo Able channel. So welcome once again. We continue with this free course on the Mishnah, which I hope is enriching your knowledge of the Bible and that ancient world that has left so many legacies to our civilization. Today we begin with chapter 3 of Tractate Berakhot, the first tractate in the section called Ziraim, or Seeds of the Great Encyclopedia compiled in the Mishnah, which comes as infinite knowledge from the heavens, passed from tradition to tradition since the time of the prophets. As a quick recap of what we have studied in this course, in chapter 1 of Berakhot, we basically studied the importance of reciting the Shema as the most important commandment of the Torah of Moses, and we looked at its main regulations and customs for reciting it at night, during the day, and on the journey. Later, we studied chapter 2, where we explored the importance and differences between the Shema as a commandment of the Torah of Moses and other prayers, such as the Amidah and the Havaninu, or Lord's Prayer. And in this same chapter, we studied 4 incidents where Rabban Gamliel showed us the difference between the commandments of the Torah of Moses and the rabbinic fences or regulations to protect the Torah. In other words, chapter 2 of Berakhot deals with the jurisprudence regarding the recitation of the Shema. Now, in chapter 3, which we will begin today, we will study the recitation of the Shema from another perspective, always focusing on the Torah of Moses, but with different conditions, such as when there are forces of purity and impurity that allow or disallow the recitation of the Shema in life and in death. Without further ado, this is Abel Flores. Let's begin. Thus we read in Mishnah Berakhot chapter 3.1, one whose deceased relative lies unburied before him is exempt from reciting the Shema, the Amidah prayer, and the mitzvah of putting on phylacteries, as well as from all the commandments of the Torah. As for the pallbearers, their replacements, and the replacements of their replacements, those who stand in front of the coffin or behind it. Those who are needed to carry the coffin are exempt from reciting the Shema, while those who are not needed are obligated to recite it. However, both are exempt from the Amidah, as they are preoccupied and cannot properly concentrate on the prayer. This Mishnah establishes 3 normative blocks. The first is the onen, which in Hebrew means one who has his deceased mutal lefanav unburied. Before him this person is exempt from the Shema, the Amidah, tefillin, and all the mitzvot of the Torah. The second block mentioned in this Mishnah are the pallbearers, Nashii Hamada, their replacements, Chilyuphayim. And the third block are the replacements of the replacements. If they are necessary to carry the coffin, they are exempt from the Shema. If they are not necessary, they are obligatory. Both necessary and unnecessary are exempt from the Amidah, which is the prayer we already studied in general terms, also known as Shemini Esra or 18th, because it has 18 blessings. The main difference between the Shema and the Amidah is that the Shema is of Oreda origin, a commandment from the Torah of Moses, and can be recited individually, like a 911 emergency call to speak with God twice a day, once at night and once in the morning. The Amidah, on the other hand, is a prayer that complements, but does not replace, the daily sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. Although it originates from the prayers of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, its origin is recognized as rabbinic or derabanan. But up to this point, we need to explain a concept. Although more than a concept, it's a term applied to a person. The one who is the direct mourner of the deceased is called an onen in Hebrew, and is the first one mentioned in this Mishnah in Berakhot 3.1. The onen is the person whose close relative, father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, or spouse, has died and has not yet been buried. This period during which the body has not yet been buried is called aninat in Hebrew, from which comes the term one, and extends from the death to the actual burial. The onen is exempt from the positive mitzvot of the Torah, such as reciting the Shema, praying the Amidah, donning tefillin, making blessings, and Torah study, among others, during their aninat, that is, between the time their loved one passed away and the time they have not yet been buried. The reason for exempting the one from fulfilling the commandments is twofold. On the one hand, due to kvod hamet, the honor owed to the deceased, who requires immediate attention for burial. And on the other hand, it is due to terda, the emotional preoccupation that prevents one from praying or fulfilling the commandments with proper intention, kavanah, due to being preoccupied with the process of burying one's loved one. Now, knowing this, you should know that there is a difference between mourning, which is called avalad in Hebrew, and this first part, which is called ananut and occurs while the body of the loved one has not been buried. Just as there are two parts to weddings according to the Torah and Judaism, as we studied in past Mishnah, there are also two parts to mourning, as we are studying today. So, let's summarize up to this point. The onen, before the burial, is exempt from mitzvot or positive commandments, meaning those that require doing something, because the onen is focused on the burial for the honor of their loved one, and doing it as well as possible and as quickly as possible is important according to Judaism. And we also have, in the second part of mourning according to the Torah and Judaism, the avel, which is the mourner himself, who was previously the onen and now, after the burial, begins his 7 days of mourning. This mourner or avel is again obligated to perform the mitzvot, but subject to the laws of mourning, avalad, such as restrictions on clothing, work, and others during Shiva, which is the week of mourning and signifies 7 for the 7 days of the week of mourning. We also have another figure here known as the shomer, one who guards the body, who shares the exemption from reciting the Shema, even if they are not related, because it is part of their funeral duties. It could even be their job. On Shabbat or holidays, although external displays of mourning are suspended, internal aninat is maintained. That is, the onen remains exempt from positive prayers and mitzvot, even on Shabbat. In fact, if a person dies on Shabbat, the community and those involved must break Shabbat to dedicate themselves to the burial of their loved one. In short, we can say that the onen is the one who bears the immediate responsibility for the burial. For example, a son for his parents or a husband for his wife. The onen is the closest direct relative, and halakha, or rabbinic regulations, prioritizes this task over ritual practice, teaching that the honor of the deceased precedes even the Shema prayer as the most important commandment. Rambam Maimonides comments in his Parush HaMishneh that mutal lefanav is equivalent to before burial, even though the body is not literally in front of it, reinforcing this functional reading. Here too, there are 3 underlying halakhic principles. First, the osek bi mitzvah patur min hamitzvá. Whoever is engaged in one mitzvah is exempt from another that is presented to him concurrently. This rule is learned from Deuteronomy 6 verse 7, when you walk on your way, and is elaborated upon in the Gemara, in Sukkah 25a, and is the basis for exempting necessary porters from the Kiryat Shema. And second, the Torah and kavanah, which is the concern and attention required for the sacred recitation of the Shema. The Mishnah distinguishes between Shema and Amidah, as we have already explained. Although some are not technically engaged in carrying the coffin, and therefore must recite the Shema, all of them, necessary or not, are exempt from the Amidah because they cannot concentrate properly. Various commentators, such as Bartanura, explain that the Amidah requires intense kavanah. When there is Torah, funeral concern, the mind is exempt. And for this reason, the Shachamim decided to exempt the burial participants from the obligation of reciting the Amidah. And there is a third principle, kvod hamet, for the sake of honoring the deceased, and the extension of the onen. The broad exemption from the onen preserves the focus on the dignity of the deceased and the logistics of the burial. The Gemara formulates the rule, as long as it is incumbent upon him to bury him. From this arise cases such as the custodian of the body, the shomer, even if not a relative. He is also exempt from Shema and all obligations, as we have already explained. In the Talmud, Berakhot 18a and b, the onen is defined as the one who has the responsibility of burying the body. This obligation obviously ceases after the burial, and then the second stage of mourning begins with the week and the avalad. In Shulchan Aruch, Yordaya 341, Laws of the Onen, it is added that the onen abstains from meat and wine until the burial, with exceptions on Shabbat and holidays. This practice is recognized by the poskim. The practical nuances today, where, as we have already explained, there is a different Judaism because times have changed. If third parties are involved in the burial, for example, the chevra kadisha. the group in charge of burials in Jewish communities today. They assume full responsibility for the management, but there is debate about whether the onen's exemption ceases. Some maintain that he remains exempt, as long as the general duty of burial remains incumbent upon him. Others believe that, upon operational disengagement, certain obligations could resume. In common practice, the exemption remains in place until burial, although there are customs that make it more flexible when the family formally disengages. Just to clarify these concepts, let's repeat these terms. The differences between onen and avel are as follows. The onen is observed until the burial and is exempt from positive mitzvot, such as the Shema, the Amidah, tefillin, blessings, and Torah study. All of this is due to kvod hamet, honoring the deceased, and turda, which is the concern for the entire burial process. The avel, which is the same wani, but after the burial is again obligated to perform most mitzvot, recite the Shema and pray the Amidah, but there are mourning restrictions. Tefillin, the first day of traditional mourning, is restricted because it is a pure ornament, deduced from Yechezkel 2400 hours 17. They are then resumed. Let us also remember that on the first night of mourning, one does not take a bath, but this is a rabbinic restriction or regulation. Therefore, Rabban Gamliel did take a bath because he was in poor health, and not bathing caused him suffering. The relatives included in the laws of mourning, both in the aninat and the avalat, are 7: father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, and spouse. For these 7, onen applies until burial. If the funeral home or chever kadisha accepts all, many poskim maintain the exemption from onen until burial. There are customs that allow Shema/tefillah to be resumed if the task no longer falls to the mourner. Torah study and reciting Berakhot are suspended during the aninat. The onen does not place tefillin. After the burial, now as avel, the first classical day of mourning has its own regime, linked to pir, but we will discuss this later. But why is the Shema recited for some and the Amidah not for anyone? Shema can be recited with minimal kavanah, especially in the first verse, and so even those not needed to carry the coffin are not exempt. The Amidah, on the other hand, demands sustained mental presence. Even those not carrying the coffin are troubled by the funeral, so everyone, whether necessary or not, is exempt. Now, let's study something that will help us understand this Mishnah much better. What a Jewish burial was like in the Mishnah and Second Temple era. Its mysteries, curiosities, and secrets of a rite that mandates the entire community. The practices described here are based on early rabbinic sources in the Mishnah, Tosefta, and funerary tractates, but also on archaeological finds in Judea and Galilee. There are 2 foundations or bases for burial, kvod hamet and tahara/tuma. Kvod hamet, honor of the deceased, mandates prioritizing immediate burial, as stated in Deuteronomy 21 verse 23, and organizing the community for the burial. The corpse generates maximum impurity, emet, with strict rules regarding contact, transfer, and spaces, according to Mishnah Ohalet 1-3. And the Kohanim, priests, avoid impurity due to death except in the extreme case of a mitzvah, a corpse without a mourner, which even nullifies its restriction, as stated in Mishnah Nazir 7:1 and Berakhot 3.1. Now, let's study something that will help us understand this Mishnah much better. What a Jewish burial was like in the Mishnah and Second Temple era. Its mysteries, curiosities, and secrets of a rite that mandates the entire community. The practices described here are based on early rabbinic sources in the Mishnah, Tosefta, and funerary tractates, but also on archaeological finds in Judea and Galilee. There are 2 foundations or bases for burial, kvod hamet and tahara/tuma. Kvod hamet, honor of the deceased, mandates prioritizing immediate burial, as stated in Deuteronomy 21 verse 23, and organizing the community for the burial. The corpse generates maximum impurity, emet, with strict rules regarding contact, transfer, and spaces, according to Mishnah Ohalet 1-3. And the Kohanim, priests, avoid impurity due to death except in the extreme case of a mitzvah, a corpse without a mourner, which even nullifies its restriction, as stated in Mishnah Nazir 7:1 and Berakhot 3.1. T from the Amidah for lack of concentration, Mishnah Berakhot 3:1. The musicians and mourners, not even the poorest man in Israel, was allowed to have fewer than 2 flute players and 1 mourner, Mishnah Ketubot 4:4. This is not folklore, it was part of the deceased's social honor. The eulogy, hesped permitted and recommended, with limits to avoid exaggeration, Mishnah Mode Katan 3-9, 10. What was the burial like? Second Temple tomb typologies. Archaeology of Jerusalem and Jericho teach us that there were 3 types of tombs, kokim, which were like horizontal niches in family caves, archosolia, which were like benches carved into an arch, and golol and dofek, which were technical rabbinic terms for the slab/cover and sides of the tomb, according to Mishnah Ohalet 2:4. Ossuaries, stone ossuaries, this was a distinctive practice in a primary, cave, setting, and after a year, that is, after the first year of burial, the bones were collected in a limestone box, with a name inscribed in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. Thousands of ossuaries have been found, for example, in the Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem, such as the ossuary of the high priest Caiaphas. After the burial, Avalat, mourning in Hebrew, begins. Shiva, 7 days, meant staying at home, sitting under a blanket, without tefillin on the first day for many uses, and comforting neighbors. Sudat Havara, the recovery meal, prepared by third parties. Round foods, e.g. lentils and eggs, symbolize the cycle of life and death. Then came a third part of mourning called Shloshim, or 30 days, and, for father and mother, a year with restrictions on festivities and personal arrangements, according to Mishnah Mode Katan 3. 10 cups in Jerusalem. Tanaic sources allude to cups of consolation served to mourners, a practice that grew and was later limited due to abuse. Tosefta Maser Sheni 4, Semashot 12. Purity, architecture, and logistics. Little-known details that we will reveal to you today. Doors and roofs, vehicles of impurity. The impurity of the deceased is transmitted through the ohel, covered space. Therefore, the legislation of Ohalet discusses doors, lintels, and perforations. A hole the size of a hand can ventilate or cut the chain of tumah. This determines how a body is moved through covered alleys. The pilgrims' roads, so that the Kohanim and pilgrims do not to ensure that the burials of those who were to become unclean, elevated routes and markers were planned. Burial on roadsides was also avoided. Part of the urban planning of late Hasmonean and Herodian Jerusalem is understood by these laws. The economy of the funeral. Before Rabban Gamliel's decree, funerals ruined families. The transition to standard shrouds democratized funeral honors and is one of the great social shifts recorded in rabbinic literature. Languages and identities on ossuaries. Bilingual/trilingual inscriptions, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, reveal family networks and mobility. Names with theophoric symbols, Yachanan, Jehozadak, and Greek Jewish symbols, Alexas, Martha, abound. Geometric iconography, rosettes, lacks human figures. Jurisdiction and crimes related to the dead. Desecrating tombs was a punishable offense. The discovery of pagan cursed tablets, depictions, in Judea contrasts with Jewish aniconism, but there are warnings in Hebrew/Aramaic of whoever opens this tomb, for example. And it's worth asking whether, during this Second Temple period, Shevra Kadisha existed in antiquity. The establishment and formal institutionalization of funerary societies came later, in the medieval period. In the Mishnaic period, the communal obligation to bury, chesed, shel, emet, was already clear. Neighbors and local brotherhoods, without the later corporate structure, assumed tahara, which is the purification of the corpse by washing it, cutting the nails, and cleaning it, as well as its transfer and burial, as stated in Tosefta Megillah 1, Semashot. At that time, there was a central tension between purity and compassion.
Met mitzvah. If there is no mourner, the first person to find the body must bury it, even if he is a Kohen or a Nazarite, Mishnah Nazir 7:1. Extreme compassion suspends purity taboos even among Kohanim or priests. At the same time, pilgrimage and worship feared tuma, or impurity, hence the ritual engineering, whitewashing of graves, paths, water from para aduma to sprinkle the impure, Mishnah para 3-4. Jewish burial at the time is a total social device. It combines an ethic of compassion, purity engineering, and ritual economy. Its mysteries, from why graves were whitewashed to why bones were kept in boxes a year later, have a common thread, honoring the deceased without paralyzing the cultural life of the community. Well, as we're almost at the end of this class, and since we still have a few minutes left, let's study the biography, life, and work of one of the great sages of the Mishnah. We've already studied the life of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabban Gamliel, Hillel, and Shammai, and even some of the life of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the Tanna Kama who wrote the Mishnah. However, there's one sage we've already mentioned a couple of times, but without explaining who he was or his legacy. We're talking about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Shenaniah. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Shenaniah, born in the 1st century, when the temple was still standing, was a second-generation Tanna, a central disciple of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and a bridge between Second Temple Judaism and Yavne Rabbanism. Standard encyclopedic sources list him, along with the excommunicated Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, among the 5 boarding students of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and as a key teacher of Rabbi Akiva. That's right. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah was the direct teacher of Rabbi Akiva, who is considered the father of Rabbinic Judaism. We will understand why later. Rabbi Yehoshua was of Levite lineage and, according to Talmudic tradition, was a cantor, musician, in the temple. A passage in Erichin 11b places him among the Meshorim, singers,
and not among the Shoerim, gatekeepers. Furthermore, a tradition from the Jerusalem Talmud records that his mother carried his cradle to the synagogue so that his ears would cleave to the words of the Torah. With the fall of the temple in 70 AD, Rabbi Yehoshua joined the ruling circle of the Sanhedrin of Yavne and embodied a pragmatic and moderate line. 2 episodes define his public profile: the calendar and national unity. Rosh Hashanah 25a, after Rabban Gamliel II officially established the new moon, Yehoshua abided by the decision and traveled with a staff and bag on the day that, according to his own reckoning, was Yom Kippur, to avoid schism. That is, although he had a different reckoning of the festivals, he adhered to Rabban Gamliel's calendar in order to abide by rabbinic authority. Although it's interesting to ask, what calendar did Rabbi Yehoshua follow? Because the difference between the new moon, i.e. Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur is 10 days. A very long difference. This is an interesting question to ask, but it's not our topic today. The other high point in his rabbinic life was the leadership crisis at the academy, Berakhot 27b, 28a due to Gamliel's repeated humiliation of Yehoshua. The Sanhedrin deposed him and appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. The study was open to all, and matters stalled in the Sanhedrin were reviewed. His halakhic and intellectual profile identifies him with the teaching Lo b'yeshemayim hai, earthly authority of halacha. In the furnace of Aknai, Tava Metzia 59b, Yehoshua confronts a bat kol, heavenly echo, and affirms that the Torah is not decided by miracles or heavenly voices, but by the human process of a rabbinic majority. This story is a pillar of Jewish normative methodology to this day, and was one of the arguments in favor of the excommunication of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Against excessive asceticism after the temple, in Bava Batra 60b, Rabbi Yehoshua discourages proposals for absolute mourning, not eating meat or drinking wine, and establishes partial signs of mourning, for example, leaving a square unplastered on the wall so that the community can live without denying the loss. Dialogue with Roman power and public controversies, rabbinic sources depict him debating with pagans, philosophers, and authorities. Hadrian and the wise men of Athens, Babylonian and Palestinian traditions preserve dialectical duels, often satirical, with the Emperor Hadrian and the Hakmayatuna, Berakhot 8b. Historiography notes that these are literary accounts rather than chronicles, but they reflect his reputation for public wit. Wine in Humble Vessels, the famous dialogue with the Emperor's daughter in Nedarim 50b, The beautiful Torah, housed in an ugly vessel, is a paradigm of his ingenious teaching and humility. He was a colleague and antagonist of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, his counterpart in numerous rulings, and a teacher, among others, of Rabbi Akiva, thus consolidating the continuity of the tradition before and after 70 C. But what were his doctrinal themes in which he excelled? Resurrection and the world to come. In debates with Sadducees and Minim heretics, he presents exegetically arguments in favor of the resurrection based on patriarchal promises, for you and for your descendants, cited by rabbinic tradition. Sanhedrin 90b. Calendar and festival politics. In addition to the Rosh Hashanah 25a episode, his name appears in discussions of the balance between law and social peace, where he prioritized unity over sectarian fragmentation. Tradition places his death shortly before the Bar Kokhba revolt, early 2nd century. Some sources indicate the year 131, after having acted as a moderate leader at the beginning of Hadrian's reign. Classical compendia describe him as sharp, quick to respond, and conciliatory. His self-deprecating remark is famous: "No one defeated me except a woman, a child, and a servant girl," Eruvin 53b, a phrase the Jewish Encyclopedia uses to outline his humor and self-irony. Rabbi Yehoshua was one of the architects of post-temple Judaism. It legitimizes the earthly authority of the Sanhedrin over individual charisma and guarantees ritual unity in a calendar he actually disagreed with because he followed a different calculation. It designs a sustainable mourning that doesn't paralyze life and places the Jewish sage in the Roman public sphere, defending the Torah with wit and dignity, Nedarim 50b. His legacy, taken up by Rabbi Akiva and the following generation, explains why the compilers made him a pivotal figure of the Mishnah. This concludes today's class. See you in the next video.